So I'll do, once that's okay, that's recording now. Put it like that. Amazing. So I'll do a 3, 2, 1 countdown, and then let's jump in.
Okay.
3, 2, 1, go. Hello there, people and listeners of the Hungry Podcast. Today I am beyond thrilled to welcome James Bailey onto the podcast. Our listeners have been waiting this probably for a very long time. James is the current CEO of Waitrose, who are the number one premium grocery retailer in the UK. James is responsible for 7 billion turnover, over 50,000 partners, over 300 stores, and 1 billion plus in e-commerce. Pre-Waitrose, James worked for Sainsbury's, where he was the grocery buying director, accountable for sales of 16 billion or 60% of Sainsbury's total turnover, and was leading a team of around 150 people. James is also the Ned for several challenger brands, Oggs, Hun Wines, Well and Truly. And pre all of that, James had a career at the NHS and in finance. So look, I'm so excited and very grateful for you coming on today, James. I really appreciate it.
No problem. Nice to be here, Dan.
So, the word I want to start this conversation with is the word calm. And I've done a lot of research, and the general archetype of a CEO is, and albeit this may be a little bit archaic, but the general archetype is kind of ostentatious, bit braggadocious, kind of Billy Big Bollocks, like, climbing their way up to the top. And I've seen some of that firsthand, but in two of the articles I've read, one said, James is less intense than most supermarket bosses I've met and seems genuinely quite relaxed. Another said, senior traders can often be intense, ostentatious characters. This is not necessarily a bad thing when you're managing vast revenues and driving your team on to hit aggressive targets. Bailey, by contrast, exudes a sense of calm and control, which should stand him in good stead as he faces the greatest challenge of his career to date. So you became the CEO, I think it was March 2020, so that you basically get thrown right into the hot heat of a pandemic.
Right. Yeah.
Exactly. You've got Brexit, you've got just a whole myriad of different issues. And I really want to use the word calm to unlock the start of this conversation. So could you describe where this ability to remain calm came from and how your parents kind of nurtured and shaped that?
First of all, thanks for having me. Really appreciate it. I'll do my best to throw as much interesting stuff at you and your listeners as I possibly can, and I'll try and stay calm as well. That would be ironic if I lost my tempers, wouldn't it? I think I've always, I've never really been too. I don't really get too carried away with stuff. I love the things I love, and I get excited about. I love being with my friends, my family. There's loads of stuff I enjoy, but I've kind of always had an attitude that there's much more important things going on, and certain things you do take seriously and certain things you don't. And I've always, I naturally relatively calm, don't get too carried away. I don't know how much of that, my dad is pretty similar, so maybe there's a bit of genetics in there. My upbringing was as vanilla as you can possibly imagine. Nothing good, interesting or bad particularly happened. It was all just so, which probably helped. I don't know, but no, it's that kind of attitude's kind of inbuilt. I didn't decide at one day that I was losing my temper too much, and so I should calm down. And then from then on, everything was like a cool mill pond of emotion. It was just I'm just kind of wired this way, and I'm not a big fan. Probably because of that, I'm not a big fan of huge egos generally, and definitely not at work. I think you do need, sometimes you do need in different businesses, you need a bit of ego to drive things forward. You need a bit of drive and vision, and some of those things sometimes come with ego. But certainly in bigger businesses like the ones I've worked in, those big egos kind of get in the way of common sense. They kind of start to distort room full of the sort of the mood and the vision and the quality of work being done in big rooms full of people, because more than often than not, the ego takes over from the brain, and you end up in some different places. And as importantly, maybe most people don't really enjoy working in a room full of big egos. It can be quite a bruising experience. I don't think you get the best out of people in the long term if most of the things that are driving their performance are fear or intimidation or any of those negative things. I think in the end, you always get the most out of people by engaging them, by treating everyone as individuals and finding out what motivates them and trying to create sort of an environment where they are happy and giving their best selves. I know it sounds a bit corny, but I do genuinely think eventually that's the right medium long term approach to working with people. So don't know, the calmness is kind of innate. I can't turn it on and off. The one thing is if I do lose it, then people do take notice because it's so unusual that everyone sort of rolls their chairs back to the corner of the room and says, "Oh, we better actually do something about that." So if I am going to go, it's on a very, very rare occasion that it usually works. So I keep it limited.
Yeah, there's just so my brain's kind of bubbling with questions. So the first thing you said is, egos are kind of commonplace, and it can be quite a bruising experience to work among that. And I've seen it firsthand with some of the companies I've worked for, and just through kind of friends who work in this industry. The common or maybe old school story is that the biggest ego kind of rises to the top, if that makes sense. And it's not necessarily true. But how did you navigate your way to become the CEO of Waitrose when you were potentially surrounded by some big egos? Because that sounds really hard.
Well, do you know what? Actually, I think it is becoming less and less common. I think the more common archetype for leadership these days is a bit more like me, which is, I'm not saying I'm all of these things, but it's broadly more inclusive, less egotistical, more authentic is a very overused word, but you know what I mean. And that image of it being a bit like Wolf of Wall Street, where everyone's banging on the table and jumping over and killing each other for the next sale. I think in almost every job I've done, there's been the odd example of that. But most of it was 10 or 15 years ago now. Most of the leaders very rarely do you come across a leader these days who's survived or is continuing to survive in some of our industries with that much ego overtly, if you know what I mean. Sometimes it's well hidden and stuff like that. That's okay. But I've been lucky. I've run into a bunch of people with egos who kind of hit the ropes, either because it didn't fit properly, or they got carried away, or it didn't, they couldn't pull it off. There's always the odd, there's always a little bit of politics, there's always a little bit of manoeuvring and everything else, but it's not Game of Thrones, you know what I mean? It's not, you don't have to come in and outthink everyone politically every day to survive. What you should probably do is come in, say hello to your team, have a look at the numbers, and make sure we're doing what we need to do, and build from there. And I think most people I've worked with have ended up in that space. So, not being too egotistical didn't hold me back. And if you take enough of the ego out of there, and what matters is good people, good ideas, good execution, and those things I prefer spending more time on. So there's an amazing amount of luck involved in most jobs you end up doing. So I'm going to put 90% of me getting this job down to luck, and 10% down to doing a good enough job in all the jobs on the way into it.
No, I think there's so much in that, because I think a lot of our listeners may what you talked about there, about having to navigate the politics and the egos, and I completely agree. It's redundant now to kind of go all guns blazing into these situations, because as you say, you'll fall against the ropes eventually. But how do you specifically kind of get your point across, or say what you want to say whilst relinquishing the ego? Because I'll throw my hands up if I've got an idea. My ego kind of kicks off, and I'm like, well, I think we should do this, and and then kind of, and then it's a weakness. I sometimes don't let people talk. So how do you do that? And I'm kind of asking this selfishly, James.
I think it's. There's all sorts of different things, isn't there? I think finding ways of using good questions is really important. So, if say for example, Dan, you've charged in with a cracking idea or a really awful one, probably. What's the best way of continuing that conversation? Is it, Dan, that's awful, that's never going to work for the following reasons? Or is it, okay, Dan, well, that's really interesting, I love your energy. Talk to me about what happens if this happens. What have you thought about X? Have you thought about Y? Who have you spoken to? Questions tend, if you disagree with something, or if you're not sure about something yet, there's always good questions to open a conversation up. But if you confront someone and completely disagree straight away, you can do if you want, but there's always a better conversation if you're just asking open-ended questions. And I'm not sort of suggesting you kind of deliberately construct them or come in with a set of 3 questions you always ask everyone, because it gets a little bit formulaic and again you lose a bit of authenticity. But I think if you keep an open mind and you're coming from a good place, like you're genuinely interested in someone's opinion and their ideas, starting by asking 2 or 3 good questions usually can take most of the sting out of a challenge that you're giving to someone else's idea. And it's not, you're not saying it's a bad idea, you're asking to develop the idea with them a little bit. And I think usually stuff like that helps create a better conversation than confrontation or picking on someone's idea that they've come up with and they've thought was the best thing in the world in front of other people. That's not very constructive. It's not, and also the next idea they come up with might be an absolute game changer. And are they going to come up with it if what happens when they come up with an idea is they get shouted down or belittled in front of their colleagues or anything else like that? It's not going to work. So you just got to be open-minded and constructive with people, I think.
That's so fascinating. It's almost like if you go into it with statements, statements are really combative, if that, I don't have to say that, combative, yeah. Whereas questions are more exploratory and actually open up, they, as you say, they take the sting out of it, but they actually open up possibilities to find even better ideas and solutions. And I think that's brilliant for our listeners, because I think a lot of our listeners are challenger brands, and the founders often are super single-minded, and I'm sure you'll know this with the brands you've worked with, super single-minded, like this is the way I want things done, and that's super actionable. So I interviewed Ed Perry from Cook 2 weeks ago, and he's a really, really good guy, and he was basically saying that he struggles to stay calm. It's almost like the complete opposite to yourself. Yeah. And one of the words he said to navigate all the kind of the inflation, the cost price increases going through, cost living crisis, he said he needs to stay calm. That's what he needs to personally do. I would love to know what has been the hardest day in your career when you didn't stay calm initially, yeah. and it did emotionally sting, and then how did you navigate out of that?
Good question. I often refer back to something that happened when I was at Sainsbury's, and it's a good answer to. It's an okay answer to this question. It's a good answer as well to what happens when you get a setback in your career a little bit. I won't go into all the details, but it was basically I'd been promoted to a director. I was relatively young, not the youngest, but quite young, and I felt a little bit of that. And it was my first chance to talk to my whole team. There's about 200 people in the room. And in Sainsbury's, there's a sort of an underground auditorium, so it's a bit like being on the stage at the National Theatre sometimes. But I'd had a chance to think about what I wanted to say to everyone. And the thing that was the most important to me all the way through my career, actually, the thing that has most interested me most often is the culture at work and how we work and how you improve engagement, how you improve autonomy and happiness at work, and the impact that can have on the working environment and the results. So I kind of had a think about that, and I thought, right, so now I'm in charge. Probably a mistake at the time, but now I'm in charge of this team. How do I want to position that? How do I want us to work? I think that's the first most important thing to talk to everyone about. So I stood up and I sort of said, look, I think it's really important that we're all engaged and we're all happy in what we're doing and we know what needs doing, and it's a nice open authentic room and we can all talk to each other about whether we think these are good or bad ideas. And I think being able, I think having a high degree of trust is important, and being flexible and things like that. And I kind of talked about the way I wanted us to work, being a bit more flexible. And I'd said, I personally won't be checking where everyone is. That's ridiculous. I trust you guys are doing a good job. It's going to be about the work we do, not where we do the work. And all things that sound a bit old-fashioned now, but they were this was about maybe 10 years ago. So at the time, it sounded revolutionary to my ears. Anyway, I thought it was really good. And I said at the time as well, I want a good work-life balance for everyone because I think it's really important. So I said that we won't the only sort of rule I want to try and work together on is that we won't send emails between 6 in the evening and 8 o'clock in the morning, right? So that when you go home, and at this point, some people, this is how old it is. You had like a BlackBerry or something, or you could still get work emails on your phone or something. And I wanted people to be able to go home and not be constantly looking at their phone, right? So it was either buzzing or they weren't switching off and they're coming in exhausted the next day. So I said, right, no emails between 8 in the morning and 6 at night. And everyone left, and it felt quite positive. And I thought, right, this is great. We're gonna push on it and work together as a team and do things differently. And this was in the morning, and around about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I got a phone call from one of the directors, proper directors, not just like mini directors of the business, and said, James, someone just called me and said that you told your team that they could all work flexibly and that they wouldn't be sending emails after a certain time and stuff. And I said, yeah, I did say that. It's really good, isn't it? And they said, no, that's awful. That's not the company policy. You can't say that to one team and have your team working one way and everyone else working a different way. And it'd gone all the way to the top, and the people at the top at the time weren't particularly open-minded, should we say, about flexible working, and the idea that you would trust people to work on what they're doing and in the way they wanted to do it. And so I broadly, in the space of about 8 hours, I got a phone call from that person, and then they said, well, so the boss is going to call you, and he wants to understand exactly what you said, and based on what exactly you said, you might get fired because you've completely undermined company working policy, and you can't just go out and say these things, etc., etc. So this is the Wednesday of my first week as a director, and I was sitting.
How old were you? Sorry, just.
Oh, I would have been late 30s, something like that.
Okay, yes. So yeah, okay. Just to get some context, yeah. So it's still pretty young in the grand scheme of things, yeah.
Well, I think so, yeah. I mean, not compared to a lot of people probably. It felt young at the time. But yeah, so I was 3 days in, and I was getting a phone call from basically the boss of Sainsbury's to check what I'd said, and if I'd said the wrong thing, I was going to get fired. And I was completely blindsided because I was like, I'm pretty sure I haven't said anything too bad. I was just saying the things I believe in and I want the team to get on with. And anyway, so I was absolutely mildly petrified. But there was a part of me that said, I've not done anything wrong, so I don't know. I'm just going to say what I said, and if that was the wrong thing, I'm going to have to take it on the chin. And as it happened, it was okay. I kind of got a slap on the wrist and a telling off, and had to sort of apologise to a few people. But about a week later, after I'd finished panicking slightly, I kind of realised that actually what I'd done was assert the things I did believe in, and that was pretty important to me. And I didn't think I'd said anything wrong, and I did think those things were the right things to do. And lots of people have come up after us and said, "Oh, I hear you got in trouble for that. I think it was worth it because someone needs to say those things. We need to change the way we work." And I think on the one hand, I learned you've got to be conscious of the impact you have in certain jobs, and the fact that you're not just talking to a room of 200 people underground in a head office. Sometimes it has a lot more impact than that, and you need to be a bit more wary of that. But I also learned I learned if you believe, I think if I believe in something, if I think it's the right thing to do, I don't mind who hears it. And so the conviction, that conviction that you believe certain things are the right way to do things and the right things for the way people work. It could be anything. It could be different convictions. But it was the first serious time I nearly got fired, and it was for saying something I really believed in. And I kind of, I know it sounds corny, but I kind of thought, well, if you're going to get fired for something, it might as well be something like that. I don't know what I was supposed to learn from that situation, but what I did take away was you might as well just go for the things you believe in, because if they don't fit in the environment you're in, you're better off learning that straight away. And there's definitely no point in hiding. I could have turned around and said, "Oh, I don't believe in those things. I've changed my mind. We're going to do it differently, etc." But I wouldn't have believed it. And so, yeah, I kind of, it was an unusual way to learn it, but I think I learned in that moment and through that process that you might as well. There's one of my favourite phrases. Apparently, comes from a Mexican revolutionary called Emiliano Zapata, and I think, let's say it was him who said it, basically said it's better to die on your feet than live on your knees. And I think when he was saying it, it probably meant a lot more. But when I hear it, I think, well, you might as well stick to your beliefs and say the things you believe, because otherwise you're going to look back and think, I never really said what I meant to say, and I never found out what other people would or wouldn't, how they'd react to it, or whether it was important, or whether people agreed or not. So I kind of accidentally learnt that lesson by nearly getting fired from the biggest job I've ever done at the time.
I mean, it's what you've said there. It's better to die on your feet than live on your knees, and I think that's just absolutely delicious. And I think having your own personal principles to make decisions from is really strong, and your own values. And I think there's so much in that for our listeners. And I also think it's true of questions. I think there's this. It kind of goes back to the ego thing, or the insecurity we were talking about earlier about asking questions. And sometimes in settings you can be, and I've had it before, where I'm too scared to ask a question. Whereas now, the more as I've just got a little bit older, I don't think any question's a bad question. Someone I was listening to on a podcast, like, every question's a good question. Just ask the question. And it's actually about building the muscle to ask the question. So what did it feel like when the boss called you? Like, because as I said, what did that? I'm trying to see if you've ever been rattled. Or where were you when that phone call took place, etc.
Yeah, I was at home, and I'd gone home, and I told Emma, my wife, and she kind of looked at me like I was an idiot. How could I possibly be getting fired after 3 days? And I was a little bit rabbit in the headlights. I wasn't particularly. This was before I'd had time to sort of process it a little bit, so it was all happening a little bit quickly. And so I was just sat at home waiting for this phone call and trying to decide whether how honest I am about what it was I'd said or not, or whether I try and second guess what that person might want to hear or not hear. And again, trying to second guess people and understand what they're hearing or not is not a good idea, because you end up tying yourselves in knots. So, yeah, I mean, I had to just be completely honest and say what I had said, and explain why I'd said it, and trust that it was enough not to get me fired. So, yeah, I was without using bad words, I was slightly nervous for quite a while before that phone call arrived and afterwards. But then so this was Justin King, who used to run Sainsbury's, and I hadn't had a lot of interaction with him before that, a little bit, and I kind of knew him a little bit. And he's a good guy, but he sort of takes no prisoners either. So I had kind of no doubt that if he disagreed and didn't think it was a good idea, he would probably have said so. But he texted me soon after and said, "Look, don't worry about it. You were sticking up for something you thought you believed. You've probably crossed the rails. You might need to apologise to a few people, but don't worry about it. Get on with it," sort of thing. So in the end, he was supportive. But yeah, I'm not going to pretend I wasn't slightly nervous, should we say, beforehand.
Yeah. And I think it reminds me of a great quote I love, which is you are the sum of the uncomfortable conversations you have. I think a lot of life is having really uncomfortable conversations, whether that's you know, potentially your boss calling you to say, right, if you're getting the can if this conversation doesn't go well. From our end as brands, it could be having hard conversations with the retailers that you've got to have these conversations to progress forward. What did you like? Were you just like, hold my hands up, I'm honest, this is what I said? Like, because I think it's not what you say, it's how you say it often, especially with uncomfortable conversations. So kind of how did you deliver the news, because you'd kind of gone against Sainsbury's policy?
Yeah, again, like I said, I could have probably tried to spin it or try and, as I say, try and second guess what I thought he wanted to hear or they wanted to hear or anything else. But because I didn't know what particularly that might be, I kind of didn't have that option, and because I was convinced I hadn't said anything wrong, and I thought it was the right thing to do, and the other things, I had enough conviction to take me over that line, and like I said, like in my experience, probably when I was a bit younger, I probably did try and second guess things and try and adapt to what I thought people would prefer to hear rather than really what was more authentic or anything else. And again, you end up tripping over yourself afterwards. You kind of there's a slow winding path to not being able to bring yourself to work by following that route. So I don't think I particularly thought about it too much. I just kind of do I still believe what I said was the right thing, and I positioned it that way, and I think I kind of stuck up for myself a little bit, but I was smart enough not to assert that too much, if you like. So I was I'm pretty sure I said everything I'd said and why I'd said it, and tried to make myself sound as open-minded as possible about the things I should learn from this scenario rather than getting fired. Would probably be the best summary of it.
No, but I think it goes back to this open-mindedness and open questions. I think that's real. There's real value in that for our listeners. Where I want to go now, so Waitrose have got arguably one of the best cultures, and you know, we came and did a demo with you guys at one of the partner dining rooms. And every single sort of partner and staff member was super happy. They talked about this kind of Waitrose stone that everyone seems to put on a Waitrose stone the first year they work at Waitrose because the food's so good. I mean, I was like, yeah, I'm pretty sure I put on half a stone in the afternoon. I was just scoffing my face with all manner of things. But the culture's really strong, and what I saw and what I was fascinated by is, you know, the people who've got the badges that say I've been here for like 25 years. It's very revered and how long people have been at the company. But that is kind of unique, especially in today's world where most people kind of hop between jobs every 2 to 3, 4 years. I really want to dig into this culture. So the first question is, and I think the way to do this is to almost look at your interview process to become the CEO, because the way the questions they're asking for the man at the helm are probably going to be the best lens to look through this. So what was the interview process, if you're okay to disclose, going from Sainsbury's to Waitrose?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is going to be bitterly disappointing, but mildly interesting for people because there wasn't much of a process. So, I mean, I'd left Sainsbury's the summer before and had an absolutely brilliant time for about 8 months. You know, meeting loads of people, quite a lot of, you know, I kind of indulged in a bit more of my passion on the food startups, got involved with Well and Truly, got involved with some of the other guys like Hun. Met lots of PE companies, talked about lots of interesting things. I was really enjoying it, and slowly running out of money, which is always a problem. And broadly, I was kind of answering lots of phone calls and lots of people were saying, "Can you come and talk to us about X, Y, and Z?" And I had nothing to lose, so I was just going and having good conversations with people, which is a brilliant sort of frame of mind to be in. It's very liberating. And I got a phone call and they said basically. So Sharon, who's my boss, Sharon White, a pretty remarkable person, she's new to the job of chairman of the John Lewis Partnership, and she would like to meet some people from retail and just sort of begin to learn about the ups and downs? What are the ins and outs? What should she be watching out for? Things like that. And would you be prepared to go and have a cup of tea with her? So I said, yeah, of course I would. That sounds fascinating. So I went into London and met Sharon in a really nice little tea room, and we sat in the corner. And Sharon is, if anyone gets a chance, Sharon's an amazing person to meet. She's super warm and generous and really personable. And, you know, I just felt at ease really quickly. And she kind of explained that she'd just started and was really just keen to learn. And we talked a little bit about how grocery worked and all the different ins and outs and things like that. I just had a really lovely conversation for about an hour, and nothing particularly. She asked a little bit about what I thought about the Waitrose brand and the business, and she also asked about, she'd seen on my CV that I had one of the businesses I'd worked with. So if you go back 7 or 8 years, we'd set up a program at Sainsbury's as a sort of a forerunner to what we did on Future Brands, where we did Dragon's Dens and we met loads of food entrepreneurs, and they came and pitched. And you know, I still talk to some of those guys now, like Harriet from Manor Marsh, and Jane from X of Kiddy Yum and things like that. So we met loads of really fascinating people. But one of the things I did was take on an advisory role at a social enterprise, which has morphed into a really interesting business that works with homeless people. It's a charity as well. So fascinating setup. But Sharon had seen this on my CV and said, well, talk to me about, you know, why are you working for a social enterprise? What was it like? And I just talked about the draw of business doing a good thing at the same time as doing good business, but that good business had to come first, because for all of the impact you'd like to have with your purpose, you can only have that if your business is successful. So if you focus all your time on the purpose and none on the business, it's the amount of good you can do is going to disappear because you're going out of business. And so we talked about a few of those things, and that was that. And then I got a phone call the next day from the same intermediary, and they said, oh, Sharon really liked meeting you. Can you meet her again on Friday? And this was the week of lockdown. So Boris was about to go on telly on the Friday and tell us all that we weren't allowed out anymore. And so I thought, hang on a second, you want me to go back into London on Friday when most of London is closing down? And so I did think about it a little bit, and then I got a prompt from a friend of mine that said, are you crazy? She wants to talk to you again, go and talk to her. So I was like, oh yeah, fair enough, probably. So I did. I went back, and on the Friday I went into London. It was, I can't remember the date exactly, but like I said, it was the Friday of lockdown that Boris went on TV that evening and declared a lockdown. And I went into London. It was like a ghost town. Sharon had a private members club in Soho open just for her. So that's when I started to think it was something out of the Matrix or something, because it was only her sat in the middle of this cafe. And it was a bit odd. And a nice man greeted me at the door and said, oh yes, you're meeting Sharon, aren't you? There's no one else there. So a little bit intimidating. But again, Sharon was just lovely, and we talked a lot. And about halfway through that conversation, she started sort of explaining that she might reintroduce or change the structure to reintroduce an executive director or an MD of Waitrose, and would I be interested in doing that job? And so I sort of said, well, I've been really clear, I do not want to get back into food retail, but here's the chairman of the partnership saying, would I be interested in the Waitrose job? And Waitrose was one of the very few companies that I would probably would have been different and interesting enough to convince me to go back and have a go at it. And so I sort of said yes. And she said, great, well, we'll send you some paperwork on Monday, and you know, I need to get you to meet some of the non-execs and some of the other execs around the table. But broadly, let's see if we can work something out. And apart from some Zoom meetings with some non-execs and some of the other people in the business, which took place over the course of the next 2 weeks, that was the entire extent of my interview process. A cup of tea and then a cup of coffee with Sharon. I'd love to tell you a story about a really grueling set of interviews with lots of different people and psychometric tests and some sort of test of my my stamina or something. It really wasn't. Sharon is much more personable and much more. She trusts her instincts and her judgment, and so in the end, oddly enough, it was one of the lightest processes I've ever been through to get a job.
That's kind of fascinating and blowing my mind that even at a level that big, with that many employees, with billion turnover, that it's a cup of tea in London. And I think for our listeners, hiring is the most important thing. I think if you get one dodgy hire, it can eviscerate the culture. People leave, people come and go. So it's the most important thing. But I also think sometimes they can kind of overcomplicate it. And so sometimes just going to meet people for a cup of coffee or a cup of tea. One guest on here always said he used to take someone for a cup of coffee and see how they treat the waiter, because it's almost like that's a really good indication of how they act. And so I think that's brilliant. I would love to know how's James had to change, moving from Sainsbury's to a sort of different role in Waitrose. Like what are some of the weaknesses you've had to work on as you've crossed from sort of Sainsbury's to Waitrose?
Well, I mean, it's interesting. If, just practically speaking, let's say at least 80% of what good supermarket operating, what good practice, what good strategy looks like is pretty similar between all supermarkets. There's a core set of things that you have to get right every time, and there's a lot of infrastructure and people and stuff that goes behind that. But it's 80% is a cut and paste broadly. So a lot of what I've learned and good people I'd learned from in Sainsbury's I could take over and begin to try and work out what the path for Waitrose could look like. And then the 20% is the bit that you need to spend a bit more time on, because it's the thing that makes the business and the culture different. How do you adapt to that? How do you make the most of it? And strategically, what's the most important thing for Waitrose versus a Sainsbury's or anyone else, an Aldi or anyone else? So on the one hand, there was a huge amount that I'd learned that I could almost immediately start thinking about and doing in the new job. But then the context of when I joined and the situation I joined in was pretty unique. So obviously I joined about a month after COVID started. So all of there were queues outside all the shops. Online was going through the roof, and Waitrose didn't really have an online business. But I also joined on Zoom, so I didn't get to meet anyone who I was working with before I joined. The offices were closed, so I couldn't have gone to the office to meet anyone. And it was a business that had gone from being very reasonably old-fashioned about presenteeism and being in the office to having to immediately adapt to this online flexible approach. And so I didn't arrive in a room, I didn't arrive on a lectern, I couldn't go around saying hello to everyone and sort of building trust and a bit of rapport. Everything was on Zoom. So it's a really unusual way to walk into a job in a very, very unusual customer market context. And the partnership is a really different business. So the context I walked into was exceptional, and so I was really it was really difficult to begin to build momentum and trust and connect and the kind of connections you need to get hold of a business and begin to shape and move it in the direction you're moving it in. And not least because the dominant theme, 80% of the dominant theme was COVID and keeping the shops open and whether you had enough partners and what was the law and would there be enough stock coming in. So really, really practical everyday things. There was almost no headroom in the business at all for what comes next. And it took 2 or 3 or 4 months before we could create that headroom. And I needed 2 or 3 or 4 months to begin to get to know everyone and for them to get to know me. So the context walking in was really different and difficult, and it kind of shaped that first 3 to 6 months. But like I say, 80% of running of how any supermarket runs is pretty similar. So, you've got to have the right shops in the right places. You need enough presence in the right channels. Operationally, you need your supply chain logistics, your supplier relationships to be good, your commercial setup. Your retail practice and process needs to be productive and quick, and all these things are joined up. So, and all of that is consistent across almost every supermarket. They all do it. There aren't that many differences between what good looks like. Depending on the model you're using, there aren't that many differences. So, to an extent, all the experience I had, I could immediately start working on, but the context was exceptionally different. So, it was, let's say it was a really interesting first year, shall we?
And I think it's always that 20% where people need to focus, because that's what gives you that edge in everything, not just in as a supermarket. So if we go into that 20%, like what took you by surprise by the way Waitrose operates? Like what not necessarily shocked you, but like, okay, right, this is why Waitrose is a Waitrose versus Sainsbury's is Sainsbury's.
Well, there's some things that everyone can see and feel, and you talked about going to the office and the kind of camaraderie and the sense of being a partner, and the extent to which people are invested in that idea that the business is different and it operates differently. That is a competitive advantage if you do it, if it's enabled and people are allowed to sort of given the freedom and autonomy to act on it. That's a competitive advantage. That is different. But the thing, some of it is obvious. So Waitrose is positioned as a premium experience grocery retailer. So if you're charging a premium, the experience has to match. One of the most common phrases we get back on Net Promoter Score is expensive but worth it, and we have to concentrate on the worth it, because there are a significant number of people out there who are prepared to pay for higher quality, sustainably sourced, ethically sourced, and experientially presented food. Food is important to a lot of people, and how it's made is important to a lot of people, and it might become more important to a lot of people. And so Waitrose is one of very few supermarkets or grocery retailers left at scale who are committed to sort of delivering that proposition. And so in a way, it's one of the reasons actually. I sort of said before there were a few reasons why Waitrose was one of the few businesses I would have gone back into food retail for, and one of them is that it's really clear what its brand stands for. It's not in a sort of a mirror image. That's a bit harsh, but in a sort of the other end of the spectrum to an Aldi and Lidl. Aldi and Lidl know exactly what they're doing, and they execute it ruthlessly because they know what they stand for, and customers know what they stand for. And on the other end, Waitrose M&S, similar-ish. It's not, you're not going in to get the cheapest food. What you're doing is you're going in to get the very best food, and you expect a good experience. And so that clarity of mission is very helpful, and it is broadly how you shape that extra 20%. It's what is it that we will deliver to our customers, current and future, that will make them love this business and keep coming back and being prepared to pay for the premium food that we offer.
That's so interesting. So how do you guys kind of compete with M&S? Is there, with the brands, obviously you've got the brands in, like, how do you do that?
It's all sorts of ways. So firstly, I think M&S do a brilliant job at the moment, right? They're on a 5 or 6 year path. They started back way before the pandemic. They set out some really clear priorities. They've invested in their shops, and I think they're doing a great job. But broadly, their challenge is that they are, for most people, they're not a full trolley shop. They are a sort of a basket, food on the move, premium, special occasion kind of grocer, and that's what they're trying to change with their Ocado deal, with the bigger shops and everything else. Makes perfect sense. Waitrose is a premium full trolley shop, so we offer the full breadth of everything that you'd want to buy, that you can buy in a Sainsbury's or Tesco's, but with premium experience and premium food. So if we were just competing with M&S, you'd concentrate on the things that create that difference. And for us, that is service. So our partners in branch are, we tend to regularly get high the highest service scores in the business because the partners are invested in the principle. There are enough of them to provide good service. We concentrate on the points of service around a visit to one of our shops, and we have. I mean, a really good example is we're, apart from Morrison's, we're one of the only supermarkets left who are investing in and invested in having counters, so fresh serve over counters. So Sainsbury's closed theirs a few years ago. Morrison's still have Market Street, which is great, but you know, that's a point of difference that M&S just don't have in their branches normally, and so you concentrate on the points of interruption that you do have that they don't, and of course there are other things that we can do that they can't. Like we now have our own online service, so it's a Waitrose partner that comes to deliver your groceries at the doorstep and can have a good conversation and talk to you about, you know, hopefully provide great service at the doorstep. And M&S's goes obviously through Ocado, which is also a great technology business, and so they do. There is advantages to that. So if you're competing with just one person, which you never are, just one competitor, you never are. If you were, you concentrate on the points of difference, and you make sure you deliver them relentlessly and brilliantly.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree, and I think what's really interesting is how this angle of service. Because see, for our listeners, James is currently you're at the Evesham store where we're recording this.
Yeah.
So you're like constantly not I don't mean like checking, but being on the ground to make sure everything's up and running and checking that service is it's something that you can't. Service is quite hard. I know you've got NPS scores, but often it's quite hard to put in an Excel spreadsheet, which is quite interesting. Yeah. But it's something that has to be felt, and it's more qualitative. No, I love that. So where I want to go now is I believe there's this kind of tension between challenger brands and the cost of living crisis, and Waitrose have always been the kind of they've flown the flag. They've been the bastion of challenger brands. Like you're kind of you know, you're the first to take on a lot of brands and really kind of get them going and believe in them and nurture them. So that's on the one hand, and there's also on that side there's an inherent need, as you said, for sustainable brands in better packaging, better produced, B Corp, etc. And these are, because of that, they're often more expensive. So you've got that on the say the left, and on the right hand side, let's not cover our ears and eyes. There's a cost of living crisis whereby, as a retailer, you're going to have to rationalise ranges. Maybe not as often in with the Waitrose shopper, but you know, for as you said about that full basket spend or full trolley spend is a lot of the time, you know, shoppers may be trading down from like a premium challenger brand to an own brand. So there's an inherent tension there, and I'd love to kind of get your 2 cents on it, really. So despite everything that's going on, will Waitrose still champion challenger brands?
Yes, we will. I mean, these things go in cycles a little bit. I think we've been a little bit behind the curve. I think historically Waitrose has been really strong on challenger brands. I met the guys from Fevertree. If you talk to Charlie Bigham's, you know, going back through history, I think Waitrose used to have, still has, but certainly in past had buyers who were real category experts and had a bit more autonomy to take a risk and go looking for those, you know, new breakthrough products. So, as I said, Charlie Bigham's, Fevertree, Innocent, people like that. And I think that is probably because, A, you had buyers with loads of tenure who were product experts and could have spot the trends without any help. You know, they were out and about looking for those trends, and they kind of grabbed them. And also, of course, like you say, most challenger brands are certainly start as premium products for all sorts of obvious and understandable reasons. And if you're trying to launch a premium product, then Waitrose is a good place to start, because our customers tend to be a little bit better off, a little bit more food inclined, a little bit more inclined to spend more on food. So It's a natural marriage. I get that. I don't think we've probably been at the forefront of that for maybe 7 or 8 years. There's all sorts of reasons. We don't need to go into them now. But strategically, I mean, obviously my history is at Sainsbury's was a bit of future brands and sort of trying to drive the strategic value of smaller challenger brands, premium brands, incremental product, etc. And I think it worked at Sainsbury's, and there's all sorts of reasons why it works. It will work, and it should work at Waitrose. So I don't think we've been on the ball as much as we should have been in the last 7 or 8 years. Like I said, lots of reasons, but definitely built into the strategy from now on and moving forwards. And we're in the process of trying to resource around that, so we can set up a structure that makes it as easy as possible for the buying teams here and sort of challenger brands to connect and test and learn and see what works and what doesn't work. But you're right. All supermarkets are under immense pressure on cost and margins, and the breadth of your range and the effectiveness of your commercial strategy, as in on the fixture, the structure of your merchandising, the flow of trade between the tiers in different categories, is one of the biggest drivers of commercial advantage. So there's no question that the breadth of range will come under pressure, and rate of sale will come under pressure, depending on how you judge commercial success. And so I think there will be a default move to put a bit more pressure on what might be slower rate of sale but higher ticket items, generally across retail. Not everyone maybe, but I think that you should expect that pressure. Some of your listeners are probably already feeling it. So you have to prepare for that, and you have to have good arguments why keeping your product on the shelf is a better idea than swapping it out for more varieties of Heinz soup or something that there are already quite a lot of on the shelf. And it was always a relatively simple argument for me, which was, is your product may be slightly more expensive and it might have a slightly slower rate of sale, but is that sale incremental? So if someone buys one of your products instead of a can of Heinz soup, if you have a nice premium soup brand potentially, is that sale incremental to the category? Because another can of Heinz is just going to be another can of Heinz, but growing the overall size of the category, the value of the category is more important. And yes, it may have a lower rate of sale, but it may also be a higher cash profit because you're off of a higher starting retail point. And in the blend of the category, it's in no one's medium long-term interest to have a category where there is no trade-up option. You've got to give customers the option. They may not be choosing it as much as they used to for a few years, but if you don't have that structure, then the commercial direction of that category is only going to go one way, which is lower and lower and lower. And it's harder in the medium long run. It's always harder if you don't have good trade-up options. You haven't got newness on the fixture to keep customers engaged and to keep keep growing that category. So buyers will come under short-term pressure. Good challenger brands should be using the data they've got and talking about the structure of the category and making sure you've got good trade-up options and making sure you're talking about incremental sales, not just absolute sales.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much in that, James. I think one of my first questions is I've seen it happen just lots and lots of times where brands will go into a retailer, and I think it's because of this newness and keeping the stores fresh and the customers excited. But then often because of just a lack of experience, and they may not have the big budgets to do gondola ends, to do all these expensive activations, and eventually they get kicked out. And I think, sorry, are you still there?
Yeah, I am. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah, your video's gone off.
Oh.
Hang on a sec.
You turn me off. Oh, am I back now?
Recording continues smoothly. Live video will return when their internet improves. Is the internet where you? Yeah, I can still hear you. I just can't see you. I was just. Can you, if you look on the right hand side and it says, so it says, if it says Dan Pope 99% uploaded, can you see that?
No.
And then what does it? So if you click on the right, are you on like on an iPad or a?
I'm on my laptop. It says James Bailey guest.
15%
uploaded.
Okay, cool. So the way this the way it records it locally onto your file, so it's not recorded over the internet.
Right.
So what may happen is, and this happened with Cook, is after we record, you may just need to nip somewhere where there's better Wi-Fi to upload it.
Yeah, no,
it should only take a couple of minutes, but it's just.
Sure.
I almost had it with Cook, where the full episode went out of the ether. I was like, no. But I was like, this can't be. Yeah, it was there, but yeah, no, that's fine. Cool. So I've got you loud and clear now. So yeah, that afterwards, if there's anywhere in that store with better Wi-Fi, that would be super helpful.
Yeah. All right, I'll give it a go. I'll be in some other places later as well. So if it doesn't work straight away, I'll make sure it's hooked up next to the router from now on.
I know, amazing, and yeah, as long as it's on that laptop, it should upload it. Okay. Cool. So what I was saying is, so many brands go into the supermarkets, and a lot of them don't have the budgets of the bigger brands ultimately to invest in the gondola ends, the secondary space. And I think one of the painful things is for a lot of founders, it's their livelihood. There's a lot on the line. There's a lot more on the line, I should say. What would you say are the 3 principles or basics that our listeners need to get down to make sure that once they're in, they're going to stay in?
Well. Yeah, I mean, that's the golden question, isn't it? I mean, let me think. So I think the first thing first is always the thing that sells a product is the product, right? So for all the money you might or might not invest in point of sale, in marketing, in everything else, you're in my opinion, this is a huge simplification. In my opinion, as a founder, the most important things are relatively simple, right? How good is the product? When you can spend a lot of money getting someone to try a product, if it's no good, if it doesn't taste good, almost no one's coming back to buy it the next time, right? So all of the talk about repeat rate and acquiring new customers, it's all great and it's all good practice. None of it happens, none of it works if the product's no good. So always first things first. How much time are you making sure that the product you've got tastes great, customers love it, and it's doing the job it needs to? So I know it sounds simplistic, but first things first, get the product right. Secondly, and it's the only thing, so there's 2 things. Secondly, get the branding right? You may have a million reasons why customers should buy your product. It could be beautifully sourced. It could be made artisanally. It could be, keto or gluten-free, or it could be, like Tony's. It could be slave-free or something. It could have a really serious purpose that you believe wholeheartedly in. But if you look at Tony's chocolate only, brilliant product for a start, right? So why do people buy it again and again? This might be oversimplifying, and the guys there might kill me for saying it. I think it's because the product tastes amazing, right? So people go back and buy it because they love the product, and the branding is as in your face bright as it possibly could be. So the 2 things that you have to, you'd always focus your time and effort on: get the product right, get the branding really clear and bold, and don't overcomplicate those 2 things. You can and I think if you're relentless about that and don't get distracted by there's going to be a million things that want to distract you. If you get those two things right, broadly, you've got a much better chance of staying on the shelf. If you get them wrong, you've got almost no chance of getting on the shelf, and then likely you won't stay on the shelf because there just won't be enough repeat or rate of sale or pickup or anything else that comes with it. So, I mean, I know it sounds simplistic. Get the product right all the time. Get the product as right as you possibly can, and make sure it's the customers who are buying it because they love it, not because it's cheap, not because they get a voucher. They're buying it because they love it, and that in the end is going to be the thing that keeps it and gets it on shelves and keeps it on shelves. And the only other thing I would say is it's really tempting, because it's your baby and because it's a really unusual world, grocery retailing, that getting on the shelf is very exciting. You know, you go on LinkedIn and there's lots of people with, you know, doing an excited star jump outside a shop saying, excited to see my product in the branch. And that's brilliant because it's about the passion and the joy that comes with seeing your project go somewhere. It's really easy to get drawn into the complex world of it and to be, you know, a supermarket will usually say, can you invest in more promotions? Can you invest in a barker? Can you invest in our social media? Can you invest, you know, there are a million things, a million different ways of wasting your money when you're working with a supermarket. You've got to be quite focused about things you think will get you a return on investment. You haven't got much money to invest. You know, Heinz, Pepsi, everyone else, they can afford to lose money here and there, but they are ruthless about return on investment. If they're going to spend some money, they want to see they're getting a benefit for it. And so, tempting though it is, and there might be a little bit of, I have to do as I'm told, or I can't be seen to be argumentative or anything like that. You've got to be, you know, you've got to be the business person in that room, not the founder. And the person who owns that business is interested in what return am I getting on my investment. So be very, very careful and try and be as strong as you can about only investing in and supporting the products in the way that you feel confident it's going to get a return on investment, not because the buyer asks you to pay for a barker or something else. Difficult, but that's the best advice in terms of relationship management I could ever give anyone.
I mean, I love that. It's like, take the founder's hat off and have the business hat on. Because I think you're right, the passion can kind of often get pulled in, and it becomes, yes, on one side it could be excitement, which is brilliant, but then actually can turn into hazy fog simultaneously. What I do have to ask you, and I completely agree, I think the getting the product right and getting the branding right is all these things, that's the foundations. Everything else goes on top, ultimately. But I've seen it firsthand. I've got a mate, Asher, who's got a brand called Rogue. Well, he's had to actually close the business down, who got into a couple of Sainsbury stores. They had a great product. They had like espresso martini jams, and they had like that was 100% incremental, like very weird and wonderful flavors. And they had pretty good branding as well. So in my eyes, they've got the product and the branding down, but they haven't made it. Is there, other than those like foundational things of getting the product and the marketing down, is there anything else? And I mean, this could be something like just knowing your supply chain, like how often to check in with the buyer, because you know it sounds like not crazy, but when Manilife first went into M&S, we didn't even have like a plan. So sometimes brands go in without a plan. It sounds crazy, but like just some of those things, I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, again, you mentioned one of the most important things. Let's assume you've got a great product and a great brand, right? Tick, tick. What you've done there is there's no guarantee that means it's always going to work, right? There's a million different things going to get in your way after that, but if you've got those two things, you've got a fighting chance, right? You mentioned the one thing the one thing to never drop the ball on, which is supply. So the worst thing in the world would be, it's hard enough to get into a supermarket for a lot of the time. You've battled your way through the buyer, through all the admin forms, you've signed 700-page terms and conditions. You're really excited, you're about to go into 50, 100 shops, whatever it is. And they press the button on the order, and the order arrives perfectly, all ends up on the shelf, starts selling, and then you go in a week later and there's nothing on the shelf because the forecast system hasn't pulled it through. You guys haven't been able to check about rate of sale or deliveries. Most of the time these orders will fall well below any of the thresholds or the sort of the alerting systems in the stock systems in a supermarket. So there's every chance they're not keeping a very close eye on it. So if people are buying your product, the worst thing in the world after you've got through all those hurdles is not putting it on the shelf for them, not getting it to the retailer so they can sell more of it. And I've been in a number of rooms over the last 10 years where a brand has come in to try and explain that the rate of sale that the supermarket think is a product is producing is misleading because they weren't in half the shops, there weren't any products for half the time. So in some shops it was selling brilliantly because there was always product, in some it wasn't selling anything at all. And the supermarket, because they're busy, because there's not much else, there's all sorts of other things going on, they're just going to press a button and look at the average rate of sale. If you're very lucky, you'll get a buyer that then goes, oh, that's interesting. Half the shop sold 10 per week, 10 units per week, and half sold none. That doesn't make any sense. What's gone on there? They're not going to do all that work for you, most likely. So you've got to supply the product, and then you've got to make sure it's arriving in those shops for at least the first 2 or 3 months until the stock systems, the branch systems catch up, and you're into the mainstream of the flow. Because I've seen brands land in shops, sell out, and be out of stock for 2 months because the order system wasn't reordering, and the brand themselves weren't aware that was going to be a problem. You assume that supermarkets, you send it in, they're going to reorder it when they need it, and actually it's not always as smooth as that. So you do consider those first couple of months, 2 or 3 months, as kind of hypercare. If you can get into as many of those shops, check it's on the shelf. Go and speak to the branch manager or someone there and say, do you know why this isn't? Have you got any of this out the back? And just own the implementation phase there, because trust me, it doesn't matter how good you think the product is. You are 0.1% of 0.1% of 0.1% of what's going on in that supermarket at any one time, and the system is often not going to do its job properly for those first few months. So hypercare it in, and make sure that the rate of sale you're getting is actually representative of what happens when it's on the shelf, not when it's out of stock.
It's kind of, and the availability. I've almost talked about everything on this podcast, and the analogy that's come to my mind is almost football, right? So I've talked about growing the rate of sale, the marketing, the branding, the activations, the star jumps outside of the store. Yep. That's your midfield, and that's your strikers going out to get the goals. But availability is your goalkeeper. Like, if you don't have availability, you really, it's an own goal. You're shooting yourself in the foot, and I think it's something I haven't. I've talked about all not the bells and whistles, but the fun bits, the getting the goal in the net and how are we going to attack. But without the availability, and I've seen it firsthand when you're not on shelf and the rate of sales plummeting. And I think one of the biggest things for the brands exist in a brand bubble where you think everything revolves around whatever brand it is. Whereas actually, and I know I learned this the hard way, but the retailer's got a gazillion brands, a bazillion things to bazillion. It's not even a word, but loads of things to manage. That you are that 0.0.001% of their priorities. So I think that's fascinating. And in terms of so you'd say in terms of the actionable things, so you'd say doing the store visits and checking the first time. I think one of the things we always used to do was the relationship with the supply chain is just as important as the relationship with the buyer. Definitely. So build that. I mean, with when we were working with Co-op, was we'd actually go up and meet go out with the supply chain teams for beers and stuff, because that's super important. Is there anything else they can, like, say a brand goes into store and there isn't availability? Like, how do they deliver that message through the kind of the rigmarole of Waitrose?
Yeah. Well, I mean, in a way, the last thing you want to be is that business, that brand that phones up on day 2 that says, "I've just been in the shop and there's no stock. What are you going to do about it?" Because the buyer is probably going to go, unless you're a really understanding buyer, they're probably going to go, "Do you know what? I'll call you back in 2 weeks' time," or something else. Because an amount of effort's gone into getting you in. It's kind of like they've fed you into the system. The system has to take care of it. They're not going to, unless you've got a really, really understanding buyer, they're not going to go and dig up the road for you and try and get that product flowing through properly. I would, if I was bringing a product in or a brand in, I would, once you've agreed it's going in, I would probably 2 or 3 months, a couple of months before launch date, I'd be, if you can, get in with the buyer or send them an email or something that says, "Look, we're really excited, we're super excited, we're going to do what we need to do to make the success in your business and give you what you need as a buyer." Connect, as you say, connect with the supply chain guys, because that's quite important. Ask the buyer who's your supply chain forecaster, who's going to be ordering the products and stuff like that. Connect with those guys. And I would say to the buyer, "Look, we're going to invest, if you're going to spend money in those first couple of months, there might be a promotion, there might be something else, that's all fine. Keep some of that money to get some help operationally." So it's either supply chain help or it is branch execution help. So can you pay some people, if you have to, can you pay some people to go and do the checking for you? Can you pay some people to make sure your operations are set up smoothly and the ordering process is going to work and there's nothing that you're going to do that's going to get it wrong? So invest a little bit of time if necessary, or money if you can, on stock and availability assurance in those first couple of months. And there's people out there that will help you with it, like Young Foodies or other people like that. And then go to your buyer and say, "It's really important for me that you've taken a punt on us. It's really important for me that we show up properly for you in your stores. So we're going to invest some time and effort in making sure the product's arriving in the shops and it's on the shelves and it looks right for you. And so this is what we're going to do. We're going to invest this is what we're going to do to try and assure you on that." And then they know that you're going to be behind the scenes checking the numbers, having someone help you check the numbers. And so if you come back 2-4 weeks later and say, "Here's what we found, we've got a little bit of an availability issue, here's what we've done about it, we've had this conversation with the supply chain guys, and we're still working on it," they know that you're after it. They know you're not telling them to fix it. And if the subject of availability or stock availability needs to come up, it's on your terms. So just for those first 2 or 3 months, let them know you're going to be investing time, effort, if you can, resource, to make sure it's on the shelf all at the right time. And it only needs to be the first 3-ish months, because after that time, the supermarket's own system has picked it up properly and it's kind of revolving through. You've got a rate of sale and it's working its way through, and it's in the right place in most of the shops by then, and it's flowing in the way it's meant to.
I mean, what you've kind of just said to me there, James, and it's striking a chord, is it's almost Waitrose have great service with the end customer, but you're almost saying brands should have great service with the buyer, in terms of, like, as you say, don't get on the phone to them day 2 being like, "Mate, where's my stock?" Or like, where's it not in stock? And then but then also seeing it as you're both on the same side of the table to grow this thing together. And I think there's just so much in that for our listeners. So we've got a hungry WhatsApp group, and told listeners that you were coming on, and it's kind of the $1 million question. And lots of our listeners want to know how to get into Waitrose. And I think from your side of the table, like, you're under pressure, cost of living crisis, Christmas is now. I think brands, as I said to you earlier, get so in their own head that they just think with, God's given son, essentially. So, like, every buyer will respond to my email. Like, I'm just going to be very frank. Imagine you had a brand, I don't know, like, I'd say it was Bailey's biscuits or something like that.
Sounds good.
What are the steps you? Yeah, sounds good. Yeah, Bailey's biscuits, maybe made with Bailey's. But say you were trying to get into Waitrose tomorrow, what would you do? Is the first question, and then the other thing is, and I know there's no like it's a variable answer, but with the deck, what do you actually want to see? Like, if you had 4 slides, what would you actually put on that deck?
Yeah, so I mean, the first question, how to connect with Waitrose. Like I said, I don't think we've made that as easy as it needs to be, and we're in the process of changing that. So, in the nearish future, we should be able to provide a gateway or a sort of a team that will take all of those calls and have good upfront conversations. So, at the moment, in the absence of that, I should be in the next 3 to 4 months latest, hopefully. In the absence of that, you're looking for someone, you're looking for a phone number or an email because as I say, it's a relatively friendly business, right? So if you do connect with someone, preferably in the commercial teams, and a lot of those emails or connects are out there somewhere on the internet, or you can ask someone else who works with them for a connection. Find someone to connect with and say, this is us. We're looking to have a quick conversation with the relevant buyer. Would you mind telling me who that is, or finding a name? So you've kind of got to work your way towards it, which I don't think is quite right, but at the moment that's probably the only way it's going to work. As I say, sooner rather than later we'll set that up so it's a lot easier for brands to come and talk to us, but at the moment that's probably the obvious way. And what it is the $1 million question. What do you put on those first 4 slides? Or do you come in dressed as a giant jar of peanut butter and sit on the steps of the head office and try and trip people over on the way in? I wouldn't, by the way, but some people do that. The most important thing is what the brand is about. Is it about why should your customers, why should Waitrose customers buy this brand? Why will they buy this brand? Is it an upgrade in an existing category? So Manulife's a great example. Sunpat, been around for hundreds of years, Whole Earth, etc. But Manulife's a great tasting product. Big fan of Pip and Nut as well. There's other brands are available. So it's an upgrade on an existing product, and that's pretty easy for most customers to understand because they already buy a lot of the core one. So think Fever Tree, think Innocent. Some of those aren't creating new food categories. They're not products that people have never heard of. They're just better better versions of a product that people buy a lot of already. So understand what you're selling and who's going to buy it, and then explain why be as clear as possible about the branding, because it's for the first couple of years probably the packaging and the branding is going to have to do most of the job of the selling. So be bold about what the product looks like, how it's going to turn up for the customers on the shelf. And if you've got the why, and you've got the product that looks professional, looks like it's it's believable that we could sell some of this. If you can, the next most important thing, if you've not got any data, if this is the first time you're talking to a supermarket, then you're kind of you can't convince them on a rate of sale from somewhere else. You can't say these are the margins or anything else you can do. If this really is the first conversation we've had with a supermarket, then the most important thing then is the product. So how can you get the product into the hands of the person who's going to try it and taste it? It's not ideal because that's a bit difficult, especially now everyone's sort of spread across the world of flexible working a little bit. But if you genuinely believe in the product, if you've got a strong brand, if you've got a reason why customers are going to buy it, to a great extent, the most important thing for a buyer is, I kind of get that. I kind of get why they might buy a premium jam or a premium something else. I kind of understand where this is coming from. The brand looks nice and bright and clear. What does it taste like? Is this any good at all? It's the obvious missing question. So I would keep it simple, and if at all possible, the obvious thing. If this is your first rodeo, the obvious thing is the product's the thing that's going to sell it. If it's not, if you've got some other people you sell with, then the most important thing is proving that it's working somewhere else. So showing a growing rate of sales, showing use the data you've got, because there's nothing that convinces a buyer more than FOMO. Someone else, it's already working somewhere else. I don't have to worry that I'm going to spend all the time putting this in and I have to take it out again 3 months later, because you can build a bit more confidence by saying, look, it's already in Ocado, it's already in somewhere else, and we sell a lot of it. So if you've got that, use it. If you haven't, it's going to have to be the product itself.
That's fascinating. And then, you know what you were saying earlier about this 80% of like when you've moved from Sainsbury's across, 80% of kind of grocery is the same, and there's that 20% edge where it goes to different retailers. And I think from the brand side of things, we are very good at that 80% of like, this is the brand, this is what we shout out about. Most of the packaging is really garish as a good at PR. That stuff's good. The 20%, which is almost the bit that kind of seals the deal, really, which is these case studies, which are fantastic. Would you want to see like a rough calculation of like, okay, if we're in X number of stores, this is predicted rate of sale, like this is the P&L for what we could make for you in this year, this is how we'd support the marketing plan? Do you think it needs that, or is that more of a discussion once you have the meeting? And I appreciate it's an art, not science, but... Yeah,
you're kind of more appealing to the heart than the head in those first interactions. So I wouldn't go into, here's an all singing, all dancing business plan, and I'd even be quite simple about that afterwards as well. I wouldn't try and over professionalize or over complicate the conversation. And those first interactions are, is there a market for this product? Does this buyer believe? Do they like it? Do they believe in it? Even if they don't like it, do they think their customers will like it? More importantly, so I would try and keep it as simple as possible to begin with, but you have the commercials in your back pocket and know what you want to sell it for, know what you might be able to offer on promotion a little bit, but I wouldn't go in with all of that, because that's the kind of detail you get into once you're motoring. It's not, and before you get on the shelf, obviously the buyers want to know pricing and everything else that comes with it and how might you support, and that's great, but you've got to sell it. You've got to get over that first line, and that's a heart rather than a head conversation to begin with.
I love finding principles, and it's heart versus head is brilliant. I love that. Where I want to go now, and I'm obsessed with this kind of this hardware versus software of leadership, and I think so. Hardware is stuff that is kind of principles that you're taught through courses, etc. Whereas software is something that you personally kind of only get through experience. So an analogous example could be like football. Like people can tell you how to put a football into the back of a net, but the software and the nuances is very, like the way Messi kicks a football versus Ronaldo is very, very different. Cooking is the same thing. The principle's right. Make a burger. This is how you make a burger. If you were to get Gordon Ramsay versus Ottolenghi versus, I don't know, Heston Blumenthal, they'd probably create 3 very different burgers, right? Yeah. So a lot of our listeners are leaders. What would you say the 3 principles of great leadership are in terms of hardware, in terms of something you need to have down first? And then second is what I'd love to unpack is kind of these nuances you've personally picked up through being in the industry for so long.
Yeah, well, I think on your analogy, I'm a much more of a software than a hardware kind of guy. So I'm a terrible example of someone who hasn't learned much in classrooms or on courses or things like that, and actually I am a strong believer in personal development, and I think it means different things to different people. So you've got to kind of allow quite a wide spectrum of what someone's development is and what works for them and what doesn't work. And I'm on the one end of the spectrum where I think most of what I've learned has come from experience and from other people in just understanding and working, getting to know them, rather than particularly from a development course or something else. But it's horses for courses. And it's really difficult to you have to take a real step back and work to out of the rat race before you can get perspective on what works and what doesn't work. But the main thing I always rely on is I don't think in my entire career I've ever got anywhere if I didn't have the right team around me. I know it sounds like an obvious thing to say, but I think one of the few things I'm really good at is putting together and enabling high-performing teams, which is not as easy as it sounds, but I think that the focus on the team rather than the objective, particularly the outcome, the results, the drive, and everything else that comes with it. If I used to say to people who were doing their first sort of management leadership job that if you're spending more than half of your time on the people, you're probably going to get where you need to go. If you're not, you're probably not, and that gets harder and harder in the different jobs you do, and it's harder and harder for some of your listeners are founders. You mentioned it yourself at the start, but the number of founders I've spoken to and said that the people, the thing that takes up most of the time is the people, because there's a lot of recruitment and performance and everything else. But when you get the people right, then the whole thing works, and that is true. I think that's very, very true for challenger brands. I think it's true in nearly every work you're ever going to do. So, like I say, my focus is the software normally by default. That's just the way I'm wired, and most of my software is focused most of the time on either interesting, exciting, problem-solving stuff that gets me out of bed, or the people required to solve those problems. And it's, best case scenario, it's sort of 50-50 between the two.
Yeah, that's... so I'm conscious of your time, James. So just a few more things. I've got to scratch my itch of curiosity here. So I hope that's okay. So what do you believe is kind of the future of retail? Like, what if we were to kind of fast forward to 5 years' time? Like, what do you think it's going to look like? I'm just kind of fascinated how it's in kind of a utopian lens, how things are going to look.
Well, this is a quick fire question on the end, is it? Thanks for that. Yeah.
It's not a quick fire. It's kind of I just kind of have to shove it in there. Apologies.
No, it's fine. It's fine. Well, you know what? Most of I know this is a pretty corny way of describing it. I do love the odd quote though, but it's I can't remember who it was. I think it might have been R.C. Clarke. But the future's out there. It's just the future's already here. It's just unevenly distributed. So most of what really good and stroke future retailing will look like is already out there somewhere. So I suspect there'll be a lot more. There'll be more and more technology involved in retailing, and more in the operations than previously, if you like. So things like, and it sounds ridiculous, but electronic shelf edge labels, shelf cameras, customers passing the service and the operations burden, if you like, to customers through their smartphones, through smart checkouts, things like that. All of those things are already out there somewhere. They're just not fully embedded. They're not fully working. Automated, a little bit more automation through logistics and warehousing, all those sorts of things. Tech is going to creep much more into the background than the foreground of retailing over the next 5 years. And I think it has a profound effect on lots of things we do, and most importantly, probably on if you're able to execute that, you can probably continue to run a supermarket without taking more away from the customers, and sort of stay financially healthy. If you can't do too much of that, then a bit like we've seen gradually over the course of the last 5 or 6 years, to stay in the black and healthily in the black as a supermarket, you've seen lots of things start to be taken away from customers on to try and balance the books. So I think tech in the background rather than the foreground is going to be quite important. And this is a pet subject, but I've said quite a lot recently that I do wonder sometimes if maybe that the era of cheap food might have come to an end. And I don't mean that because we're having a huge inflationary burst, because a lot of that is cyclical, not structural. I mean it more because the percent of disposable income that Britons have spent on food has gone down nearly every year for the last 50 years. And as a percent of our disposable income, we spend one of the lowest amounts in the developed world, if that's the right phrase, on our food. So you go to Italy, you go to France, you go to Japan, you go to lots of other sort of older developed countries, and they spend a lot more on food than we do. And I wonder if, the more we peel back the layers and the real cost of food, the cost of food production in terms of sustainability, biodiversity, animal welfare, the more that gets peeled back. There's a report by the UN a couple of years ago said the annual market for food globally is about $12 trillion, and the cost, the environmental, social, and sort of climate cost of the food system is about $12 trillion, but it's not priced in at the moment. It's the invisible cost, the externalities of the food system, and I think the industry is becoming much more aware of that. Customers are becoming much more aware of that, and I do wonder if the era of cheap food, where mass production that was taking its benefit from the environment, is gradually going to have to turn around, because I don't think people are going to accept that the food system is part of the problem anymore. It has to become part of the solution. But for that to happen, most likely people are going to have to pay more for their food for it to be long-term sustainable. So I wonder if in the future, maybe not in 5 years, but in the medium, longer-term future, the role of food in people's budgets and their lives, and the importance of it more broadly, will have changed shape, so that our relationship with food becomes more sustainable.
I mean, I had never thought of it like that, to be honest, in terms of the people being happy to spend more on food, like on a macro level, not just at Waitrose, but it kind of, as you say, the environment is the systemic issue, and that's going to have to be solved. And I think there's this book by Nassim Taleb called Anti-Fragility, and it's or Anti-Fragile, and the actual definition of anti-fragility is anti-fragility goes beyond robustness. It means that something does not merely withstand a shock, but actually improves because of it. So with everything, with what you've just said there about how kind of technology is going to move into the background, not the foreground, the cost of people spending more, what do our listeners need to do now? What should they be focusing on now to build anti-fragility and to make sure they're coming out, not just like withstanding, but coming out swinging? And I ask this because I've got one of my great mates, Manish, he's had to sadly close his business, Holy Moly, which is just, he'd got it into Ocado, got it into retailers. Yeah. 3 or 4 are kind of going. It's happening, and it's sad. So what should they be focusing on now to build anti-fragility?
Yeah, I mean, it's always challenger food brands are fragile creatures until they reach a certain point, and it's really hard. You can be ranged in a lot of supermarkets. You can be into food service a little bit. You could even be international, and your economics are really challenging. So it is actually a really tough path out beyond that and into a more sustainable setup. I mean, it's not rocket science, but the obvious thing to say in terms of anti-fragility is to be as clear as you can about the path to profitability. Because the most fragile thing about any challenger brand is its cash flow, and you can't keep. There was obviously a period there where you could keep borrowing and keep raising, and there are pros and cons of that. But if that's disappeared for a while, then you have to focus back on the basics, which is how have you got a business that's resilient on its own 2 feet as much as you possibly can. And I go back to the thing we talked about earlier about making sure you're only investing in things that you're really confident about, or you're confident enough that you're going to get a return on. It's really difficult, and the economics of businesses at that level are notoriously challenging. But it doesn't take away that the anti-fragility at the moment, and for 2 or 3 years more, and actually probably longer than that, but for 2 or 3 years more, is definitely, try and set a business up that can make a profit as quickly as possible. And if you're not making a profit at the moment, if you're gradually wearing down the cash flow, how do you turn that around? What difficult decisions do you have to make to stay afloat until you're in a position where you can start reinvesting again? Because best brand in the world, best product in the world. If you've thrown all the money at the tank and you've marketed the life out of it, and you've run out, it doesn't matter that you should have been the next Coca-Cola, because you're not going to be. So it's brass tacks at the moment, unfortunately.
I love that path to profitability. Final question. So I asked this to all guests who've got kids, because I think it's a really interesting lens to look through. But I'm right in saying you've got 3 kids?
I'm aware of, not unless you know something I don't.
Sorry. Sorry, that's my brain. I haven't had enough coffee this morning, James. Apologies. So you've got 2 kids. So what advice do you give to them as they embark out on the world? Or when they embark out on the world, I should say.
Yeah, no, they haven't quite yet. To enjoy it, just to do the things you love doing. It's harking back to advice I give. The only career advice I normally give people is just to take jobs based on their instincts. So things they think they're going to enjoy, because if you enjoy it, you tend to do a better job, and you're doing a better job, so you might get other opportunities on the back of that. So yeah, kids these days are exposed to all sorts of funny, random things that I was never exposed to as a kid. So they don't, it's just to make sure they're enjoying it and they're picking things that they love, and broadly just to take that risk. Like a lot of people listening to this, if you've got founders on here, that's exactly what they've done. They've followed their heart. They've taken a big risk. They've put themselves into something quite difficult and risky. And like I said, better to die on your feet than live on your knees. You only get one round of this, so you might as well enjoy it and do the things you love doing. So, win or lose, if you've chosen those things, then you're not going to look back and regret that you never did the things you wanted to do. I haven't quite had all of that conversation with my kids. They're only 12 and 9, but that's the plan.
That's such a kind of succinct and scrumptious way to end the conversation with, die on your feet versus, live on your knees. James, that was absolutely epic. So grateful. I know this will be profoundly valuable for so many listeners. So thank you so much.
All right, no problem at all. Real pleasure to see you. And I'll make sure I'm attached to some sort of proper Wi-Fi